He laughed arrogantly and told the modest mechanic, "If you can repair this engine, I'll hand over my whole salary." Moments later, the millionaire was left speechless by what she accomplished. Before we dive into the story, share in the comments where you're watching from. And once it's over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy! I always thought I understood engines. After all, I am the CEO of one of the largest automobile companies in the country, a man who signs off on designs that will roll onto highways across the world. But the truth? I haven't touched a wrench in 15 years. I talk to investors, not machines. I manage portfolios, not carburetors. I ride in prototypes that others build. My hands are clean, my suit's always pressed. That afternoon, however, the world decided to remind me that money and power mean nothing when your own car coughs, shudders, and dies in the middle of an empty stretch of road. It wasn't just any car. It was my pride, a restored 1970 Chevelle, the machine I had purchased to remind myself of my youth, of when I used to dream about building something rather than just buying it. The irony of it giving up on me right there was almost humiliating. I stepped out, the August heat pressing down on me, loosened my tie, and looked around. To my left and right stretched an unremarkable street, cracked pavement, weeds fighting their way through. And just 50 yards ahead, faded paint, broken neon letters, a sign barely hanging by 2 screws, Barnes Auto Repair. A squat building that looked more like a relic than a place where anyone could solve a real mechanical problem. I considered calling the company's roadside assistance, but the thought of waiting an hour in this heat felt unbearable. With a sigh, I locked the Chevelle and walked toward that little workshop, telling myself I was only stepping in for directions, maybe a phone call. Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal, sharp and alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Tools were scattered across benches, gears stacked in trays, an engine block open like a chest waiting for a surgeon's hands. And in the middle of this organized chaos, bent over the hood of a pickup, was not the grizzled, cigarette-chewing mechanic I expected, but a young woman, maybe 24, her hair pulled back, streaked with grease, her hands moving with a certainty that made me pause. She didn't even look up when she spoke. "Chevelle outside? That yours?" I blinked, surprised. "Yes. How did you?" "It's leaking fuel. I could smell it before you walked in." She finally raised her head, her eyes sharp, almost impatient, like she had no time for my disbelief. "Bring it in. I'll fix it." I should have walked away. I should have laughed, called a tow, and waited for professionals in my air-conditioned office. But something in her tone, confident, unsparing, made me push open the workshop door and roll the Chevelle inside. She slid under the hood without hesitation, her hands moving faster than I could follow, her voice low, muttering to herself about pressure, gaskets, timing. Within minutes, she had the problem pinned, the carburetor adjusted, the fuel line secured. She wiped her hands on a rag, turned the key, and the engine roared back to life as if it had never failed. I stared at her, my pride dented deeper than the Chevelle had been. "You solved that in minutes. My engineers would have written a report about it first." She smirked, not even trying to hide her amusement. "Your engineers don't listen to engines. They only look at numbers. Engines tell you what they need if you're willing to hear it." For a moment I couldn't answer. The man who had commanded hundreds of engineers, felt like a student who had just been corrected by his teacher. And that was the first time in years that I realized how far I had drifted from the craft that once made me dream. I should have left that workshop with my pride intact, pretending it was a coincidence, pretending I could have solved the problem myself if I'd cared to. Instead, I stood there, watching her wipe the grease from her fingers like a surgeon finishing an operation, and felt something sting inside me. I cleared my throat, trying to reclaim a sense of authority. "How much do I owe you?" She didn't even look up. "50. I laughed. Too loud, too sharp. 50? For 5 minutes of tinkering. That's more than some lawyers charge. Her gaze met mine then, steady, unflinching. 50 for knowing what to do in 5 minutes. Not guessing for 5 hours. The words hit harder than they should have. I tried to mask it with sarcasm. Then maybe I should give you my salary, if you're that confident. To my surprise, she shrugged. Bring it tomorrow. I'll be here. I froze, caught between outrage and amusement. No one had spoken to me like that in years, not shareholders, not engineers, not even rivals across negotiating tables. And yet this girl, in a torn t-shirt with oil staining her cheek, had not only repaired my Chevelle but also disarmed me with a single line. Against my better judgment, I nodded and walked out, the Chevelle humming like new beneath me, my pride feeling oddly heavier than the car itself. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice. Engines tell you what they need if you're willing to hear it. My engineers had been struggling for weeks with a prototype issue, and all our best minds had no answers. I imagined her walking into that sterile lab, surrounded by doubters, and wondered what she would say. The thought unsettled me, not because I doubted her skill, but because I dreaded what it would mean if she succeeded where we had failed. The next morning, I did something reckless. I had my driver take me back to that faded shop. She was there, exactly as she had promised, leaning against the hood of a half-dismantled sedan. I carried an envelope, thick with cash, more than symbolic, less than insulting. I held it out. My salary, as promised. She opened it, counted the bills without expression, then tucked it into a drawer. And what lesson do you think you bought? Her bluntness cut through me. I straightened my shoulders. Come to my company. One day. Show me what you can do in real conditions. Her brows arched slightly, skepticism flickering across her face. Why? To prove you wrong? Or to prove yourself right? I swallowed. For once, I didn't know the answer. Maybe both. She smirked faintly. Fine, I'll come. But don't expect me to bow to suits and titles. I only listen to machines. They don't lie. I should have felt triumphant like a king granting an audience. Instead, as I left her workshop, I realized something unnerving. She hadn't accepted my invitation because she respected me. She had accepted because she had nothing to lose. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt the tremor of fear, not of failure, but of what it might mean if this girl succeeded. The day she walked into my company, I felt the eyes of my entire engineering department burning holes through the glass walls of the conference room. They had been working for weeks on a prototype engine failure that defied every diagnostic tool, every algorithm, every experienced guess. Millions of dollars already wasted on parts, consultants, and dead ends. I had promised the board progress. Instead, I had silence. And then, in front of my best minds, I brought her. She arrived without pretense. Jeans, worn boots, a jacket smeared with oil that hadn't been washed out in years. The contrast between her and my engineers, men in white coats, pressed shirts, holding tablets like shields, was almost theatrical. One of them, Pearson, smirked openly. This is your big solution, sir? A street mechanic? I could feel the sting of humiliation rising in my chest, but before I could answer, she stepped forward, her eyes sharp, her voice steady. Engines don't care about your degrees. They care about balance. Let me see the patient. The word patient made them laugh. But she ignored them, walking straight to the prototype engine on the test bench. For 15 minutes, the room filled with nothing but the sound of her hands moving, loosening a bolt here, pressing her ear against the housing, closing her eyes as if listening to a faint language the rest of us had forgotten. My engineers whispered among themselves, trading smirks, certain she was putting on a show. I stood back, torn between shame for bringing her here and a strange, almost painful hope. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked straight at Pearson. Your valve timing is off. Not on the surface, deep inside where your algorithm doesn't reach. One tooth on the secondary gear slipped, probably when you first mounted the block. It throws everything out of rhythm, but just barely enough to fool your sensors. Pearson flushed, his arrogance faltering. Impossible. We checked the timing a dozen times. On the outside, she countered. Engines hide their secrets where lazy hands don't reach. She grabbed a wrench, turned the casing, and exposed exactly what she described. One misaligned gear tooth. My team went silent. For 3 weeks they had been blind to what she uncovered in less than half an hour. I felt my throat tighten. Pride and shame waged war inside me. She had not only exposed the flaw in our machine but also the flaw in our way of thinking. My engineers stared, defeated, while she wiped her hands on her jacket like it had cost her nothing. Cleared my throat. "How did you know?" She glanced at me, almost pitying. "Because engines breathe, and yours was choking." For the first time in years, I had no clever retort. I just stood there, a man who had commanded fortunes, realizing that in one afternoon a girl from a forgotten workshop had shifted the ground beneath me. My team looked to me for direction, but I had no orders, no explanations, only questions. And in that moment, I no longer saw her as a mechanic dragged in for spectacle. I saw her as someone who understood machines in a way I had forgotten how to. When she left, the room remained silent, heavy with unspoken truths. My engineers avoided my eyes, their pride wounded, their authority undermined. But as for me, I didn't feel anger. I felt something worse. I felt the beginning of respect. For 2 days after her visit to the plant, I could not concentrate on anything. The board sent me reports about supply chain costs. I signed them without reading. My assistant reminded me of meetings, and I showed up only to stare out the windows. The truth was, I was consumed by the sound of that girl's voice echoing in my mind. "Engines breathe, and yours was choking." A phrase so simple it humbled the whole weight of my empire. I invited her to my office on the 3rd day, an invitation that most engineers would have considered an honor. She arrived late, without apology, wearing the same grease-stained jacket. She didn't look impressed by the marble floors, the city skyline framed in glass, or the leather chair behind my desk that had once intimidated senators. She stood near the window, arms folded, eyes distant. "I want to offer you a position," I began, rehearsed words catching awkwardly in my throat. $80,000 a year, full benefits, a chance to work with the most advanced machinery in the world. You'll never have to patch rusted trucks again. You'll have everything. She tilted her head, studying me as though I were the one under examination. "Everything?" she repeated, her voice quiet but sharp. "Do you think that's what I want?" I forced a smile. "Who wouldn't want it? You'd be working for the best." That was the moment she laughed, and the sound struck me harder than any boardroom defeat. "For the best? No, I would be working for you. That's not the same thing." She stepped closer, her hands still streaked with black oil, pointing at the framed patents on my wall. "Do you even know what these mean anymore? Or are they just trophies?" The air left the room. I straightened my posture, falling back on the pride that had carried me through decades of negotiations. "You underestimate what this company represents. It is legacy, progress, history. With your mind, you could write the next chapter." She shook her head. "History? My father built his own workshop out of nothing. He used to say machines are just iron until you hear their stories. Every engine that fails has one. Every engine that runs has one. That is history. What you do here, numbers, profits, meetings, that is forgetting." Her words left me exposed. I wanted to fight back, to remind her who I was, what I controlled. But the longer I looked at her, the more I saw that there was no arrogance in her tone, only conviction. "So you'll stay in that little shop forever?" I asked, quieter now, not mockery but disbelief. She looked out the window at the vast city stretching beyond the towers. "That shop is my father's name. It is the only thing they didn't take from him. I keep it alive because he kept engines alive. You can't buy that with $80,000. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a boy standing in front of a teacher, being told he hadn't studied enough. She was turning down a fortune, walking away from a chance to rise into the elite ranks that most would kill for. And she did it without hesitation, without regret. As she left my office, I called after her. "Why refuse so quickly? Don't you even want to think about it?" She paused at the door, her hand resting on the polished brass handle. "Because some offers aren't tempting when you know what they cost." Then she walked out, leaving me alone with the hollow echo of her refusal. I sat in silence long after she was gone, staring at my father's old photograph on the wall. For the first time, I wondered if I had built an empire, or if I had simply been living inside someone else's lie. I tried to return to my routine after she left my office, but the silence between meetings kept pulling me back to her words. Machines are just iron until you hear their stories. At first, I dismissed it as romantic nonsense. But late at night, when the boardroom emptied and the city lights flickered like restless stars, I found myself staring at the framed photographs on my walls. Pictures of my father cutting ribbons, shaking hands, posing with our earliest engines. Something in his eyes always bothered me. Pride, yes, but also a shadow. The next morning, instead of heading to my usual floor, I went down to the archives, those dusty basement rooms of the company where history slept in steel cabinets and forgotten boxes. I hadn't been there in years. The archivist, a thin man with glasses too large for his face, looked startled when I walked in. "Sir, no one from the executive wing ever comes here." "Then today is an exception," I said, waving away his offers of help. "Show me where the records from the late 70s are stored." He led me through rows of shelves stacked high with faded binders, rusted staples, and brittle yellow papers. The air smelled of dust and secrets. I began opening boxes, flipping through reports, drafts of patents, letters typed on worn machines. For hours, nothing but corporate jargon and figures. Until finally, in a box marked Miscellaneous Correspondence 1978 to 1981, I found it. A folder of handwritten notes. Not my father's, not any of the executives I recognized. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, each line signed J. E. Barnes. I froze. Barnes. The name slammed into me like a cold wave. I remembered the sign on that little workshop, Barnes Auto Repair. I read deeper. Sketches of valve configurations, diagrams of modified gear alignments, theories about efficiency that looked suspiciously like the blueprints our company used to patent its breakthrough in 1982. Yet the patents bore only one name, my father's. Not Barnes. Not anyone else. My chest tightened. Could it be coincidence? Or had the girl's father been the real mind behind the innovations that made us rich? The further I read, the more undeniable it became. Letters addressed to the board demanding recognition. Proposals for partnership. And finally, an unsigned letter, crumpled in yellow, dated the year before the patents were filed. If my contributions continue to be erased, I will take legal action. I only ask for acknowledgement. Nothing more. There was no record of a reply. No mention of Barnes in the official company history. Only silence. I carried the folder upstairs like it weighed 100 pounds. In my office, I locked the door and spread the documents across my desk. My father's face in the framed photograph seemed to stare down at me, his smile suddenly hollow. The realization cut deep. The company I led, the empire I had inherited, might have been built on stolen genius. I poured a drink, though it did nothing to steady my hands. The girl had said engines were stories, and now I held the chapters her father had written, chapters my family had buried. When I finally closed the folder, the city outside looked different. Colder. For years, I had walked through these offices believing I carried forward a legacy of innovation. Now I wondered if I had only been polishing a stolen crown. There was no avoiding it. I had to tell her. But how do you look a daughter in the eye and admit that your own father had robbed hers? The next morning, I woke with the folder still spread open across my desk. I had not slept, only sat in the dark listening to the silence of my office, wondering how many years of lies had been cemented beneath our company's shining reputation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her father's handwriting, steady and desperate, asking only for acknowledgement. And every time I opened them, I saw my father's framed smile on the wall, daring me to question him. I knew I couldn't keep this discovery to myself. But before I went to her, before I told the girl that her father's work had been stolen, I needed to confront someone else. My uncle. He was vice president now, gray-haired, still sharp, the kind of man who thrived in shadows while my father stood on stages. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. I called him that afternoon, asked him to meet me in the old executive lounge. He arrived in his usual immaculate suit, calm as if nothing in the world could shake him. "What's so urgent, nephew? You look like you've seen a ghost." I pushed the folder across the table. "I went into the archives. I found Barnes." For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then a small sigh escaped him, as if I had confirmed a suspicion he hoped I would never uncover. He opened the folder, flipped through the pages without surprise, and finally leaned back. "So you know." I clenched my fists. "You knew all along." "Of course I knew," he said evenly. "Your father built an empire. Empires are never clean, you should understand that by now." "He stole it," I snapped. "Barnes's designs, his ideas, his work. He took it all and left him with nothing. Do you know what that did to his family?" My uncle's gaze hardened, but his voice remained calm. "John Barnes was a dreamer. Dreamers don't survive in this world. He wanted recognition, your father wanted results. The board chose the man who could deliver, not the one who whined about credit. That's business. Always has been." I felt the blood rush to my face. "That wasn't business. That was theft." He leaned forward, his tone cold and deliberate. "And yet you sit here, don't you? In your glass office, running a company worth billions. Do you think that would exist if your father had stepped aside to let some mechanic take the glory? History remembers winners, not complainers. You should thank him instead of digging up corpses." His words hit like poison, and yet I saw in them the philosophy that had guided every decision before mine. The empire I inherited was built not on innovation, but on silence, on crushing those who asked for fairness. And now that silence had come back to demand an answer, I closed the folder and met his eyes. "If you think I'll continue this lie, you're wrong. Barnes deserves his name back. His daughter deserves the truth." For the first time, my uncle's composure cracked. "Don't be naive. You expose this, you don't just ruin your father's memory. You ruin yourself. You ruin all of us. The shareholders will devour you. The board will exile you. And for what? To hand back scraps of dignity to a man long dead?" I stood, my hands trembling. "Not scraps. Justice." He didn't rise. He only looked at me with quiet pity, as though I were a boy who hadn't yet learned how the world worked. "You're your father's son, but maybe you're your mother's too. Too much heart for this business. That will be your undoing." I walked out, my chest heavy, my resolve heavier. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this would be my undoing. But as I stepped into the bright light of the city, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could no longer live with the weight of someone else's theft. I had to tell her. It took me 3 days to gather the courage. 3 days of pacing my penthouse, ignoring calls, letting meetings pass without my presence. Every instinct I had as a businessman told me to bury the truth, to protect the company, to protect my father's name. But every instinct I had left as a man told me that burying the truth had already ruined too much. On the 4th evening, I carried the folder under my arm, along with something else I found buried in the archives. A manual, hand-stitched with grease-stained notes, signed on the inside cover, John Edward Barnes. The drive to her workshop felt longer than it should. My Chevelle hummed steadily now, alive again because of her hands. I parked outside and saw her through the open bay door, leaning over an engine block, her hair tied back, oil glistening under the shop's single flickering bulb. A boy skinny, maybe 12, sat cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with bolts like they were toys. He looked up as I entered. She did not. "You again," she said without turning. "What? Another offer I won't take?" I held the folder tighter. "No, not an offer. The truth." Something in my voice must have reached her, because she finally set her wrench down and looked at me. Her eyes were sharp, defensive, but there was curiosity too. I placed the folder and the manual on her workbench. "These belonged to your father. I found them in the company archives. He was the mind behind our breakthroughs, our engines, our success, all of it. My father took his work and erased his name. We made $200 million from designs that were never ours." Her face changed slowly. Confusion, then realization, then anger, each emotion tightening the muscles in her jaw. She flipped through the manual, her fingers tracing her father's notes like they were scripture. You expect me to believe you brought this out of guilt? What is this, repayment? A performance? I shook my head. Not repayment. I can't repay what was stolen. I can only tell you what should have been told decades ago. Her voice rose, breaking. You stand here in the empire your father built on my father's blood, and think honesty fixes it? You think truth erases years of struggle, of being called the daughter of a failure, of watching him die convinced he'd been forgotten? Tears welled in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. I wanted to answer, but my throat closed. And then the boy, still crouched on the floor, spoke softly, his voice fragile but clear. At least he's trying. We both turned to him. His hands shook as he held a small gear, his eyes darting between us. Nobody ever tries to do the right thing. Not for people like us. Maybe he's different. Her breath caught. She wiped her cheek roughly with the back of her hand, then looked back at me, her voice trembling with restrained fury. If you're serious, then prove it. Not with words. Not with money. With work. I nodded, almost relieved at the ultimatum. Then tell me how. Her gaze hardened. Engines don't forgive liars. Neither do I. If you want to make this right, stop hiding behind your suits and speeches. Build something. With your hands. From nothing. Only then will I believe you mean any of this. I swallowed, feeling the weight of her demand. For the first time in 15 years, I was being asked not to lead, not to manage, not to command, but to build. I looked at her father's manual, its pages trembling slightly under the draft from the open door. And in that moment, I knew my life was no longer about defending an inheritance. It was about earning it back. The next morning, I returned to the workshop dressed in clothes I hadn't worn in years. Old jeans, a plain shirt, boots stiff from disuse. My driver raised an eyebrow when I stepped out without a tie, but I waved him off. This wasn't a day for appearances. When I pushed open the door, the girl was already there. Sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, a stubborn gleam in her eyes. The boy, Chewy, as I later learned they called him, sat nearby, tinkering with an old carburetor. She didn't greet me. She just pointed to the corner of the shop where a pile of rusted parts lay scattered like bones. If you're serious, she said, then you'll help me rebuild that engine. It hasn't run in 20 years. Most people gave up on it. Let's see if you can keep your promises longer than they did. I stared at the heap. Cracked pistons, bent valves, a block corroded with rust. It was a corpse, not an engine. But I didn't argue. I knelt beside it, picked up a wrench, and for the first time in over a decade, felt the cold bite of steel against my palm. The work was humiliating at first. My hands, soft from years of boardrooms and pens, slipped on bolts. I tightened when I should have loosened. She corrected me sharply, her voice like a whip. Not that way. Listen to the tension. Feel it. Don't force what doesn't want to move. I cursed under my breath, sweat stinging my eyes. Chewy chuckled once, then quickly looked away when she shot him a glare. Hours passed. My back ached. My arms trembled. And still the engine lay before us, refusing to surrender. By midday, I wanted to quit. Every instinct told me to walk out, return to my office, send a check, and buy forgiveness the way I always had. But when I looked up, I saw her father's manual open on the bench, its pages stained, corners curled from years of use. In the margin, in faded ink, was a note. Never let an engine die alone. Something in me shifted. I pressed on. The turning point came when Chewy slid over, holding a small piece I hadn't noticed before. This gear, he said quietly. It doesn't look like much, but without it, nothing else lines up. His words echoed deeper than he knew. I fitted it in place, and for the first time, the scattered pieces began to resemble something whole. We worked until evening, our hands black with oil, our arms sore, our patience worn thin. And then, just as the light began to fade, she nodded for me to try. I turned the key. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then a cough, a sputter, and finally, against all odds, the engine roared to life, trembling but alive. The sound filled the workshop, rattled the tools on the shelves, and silenced the doubts that had been gnawing at me. I laughed, raw and disbelieving, as the vibrations shook through my chest. She didn't laugh. She only watched me with eyes softer than before, though still guarded. "You got lucky," she said, though I caught the faint curve of her lips. "No," I replied, my voice hoarse. "I got taught." Chewy clapped his hands, his grin wide. "Told you it could run again." I looked at them both, the boy full of hope, the woman carrying a legacy too heavy for her shoulders, and felt something stir inside me that had been dormant for years. Not pride, not victory, something closer to humility. That night, as I washed the oil from my hands, I realized how much I had lost by living only in glass towers. My father had built an empire from someone else's genius. But here, in that dim workshop, I had rebuilt something with my own hands. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like more than a CEO. I felt human. The days that followed became a strange rhythm, unlike anything I had known in years. I found myself waking not to the shrill buzz of corporate alarms or the endless ringing of phones, but to the thought of grease-stained hands and the unfinished engine waiting in that modest workshop. Every morning I traded tailored suits for worn jeans, and every evening I left behind the city skyline to drive to a place where machines groaned and people actually listened to them. First, she treated me like an intruder. Orders barked rather than explained, sharp corrections whenever I fumbled. Yet I welcomed her harshness. It reminded me of something I had long forgotten, that respect in real work is earned one mistake at a time. Chewy remained our silent witness, sometimes offering a bolt, sometimes only watching with wide eyes, as if trying to measure whether I truly belonged there. With each day, something shifted. My hands grew steadier. I stopped overthinking torque and began feeling it. She noticed. One evening, when I managed to adjust a valve alignment without her correction, she allowed herself a faint smile, the kind that vanishes as soon as it appears. But I caught it, and it carried me through the night like a reward greater than any corporate bonus. It wasn't just engines we repaired. Together we painted over the cracked sign that hung above the door. The faded Barnes Auto Repair letters received a new coat, bold and unapologetic, as though her father's name was reclaiming its place. Chewy climbed the ladder beside me, dripping paint across his shoes, laughing in a way that made the whole task feel less like work and more like resurrection. Somewhere between bolts and brushstrokes, the distance between us began to shrink. She started asking me questions, not about business, but about who I was before the boardrooms, before the polished speeches. I told her of the nights in my youth when I sat in a garage with nothing but a flashlight and an engine block, dreaming of creating something new. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she said, "That boy could have been a good mechanic. Too bad he let someone else's shadow turn him into a businessman." Her words should have stung, but they didn't. They sounded less like judgment and more like truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a golden hue across the workshop, I found the courage to speak what had been building inside me. We stood side by side, wiping grease from our arms, the engine we had revived humming gently in the corner like a beast tamed but not broken. I turned to her, my voice low, hesitant. "I don't come here just to fix engines anymore." She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Then why do you come?" I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to retreat, but I didn't. Because I found something here I can't find anywhere else. Not in offices, not in towers. With you, I feel like I'm not just fixing machines. I'm fixing myself. And my words faltered, then spilled out. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The silence that followed stretched longer than any pause in my life. She stared at me, her lips pressed tight, her hands trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. And then, without a word, she stepped closer and pressed her mouth to mine. It wasn't soft, nor gentle. It was fierce, filled with the weight of years of anger, grief, and unspoken need. When she pulled back, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't break this. Engines may forgive rough hands." Hearts don't. In that dim, oil-scented room, with Chewie pretending not to watch from the corner, I realized something I had never believed possible. The engines we built, the machines we revived, they weren't just iron and fuel. With her, they had a soul. And maybe, just maybe, so did I. I had spent most of my life signing documents that moved millions across accounts, authorizing deals that shifted entire markets, but never had my hand trembled as much as it did the day I signed the last page of the file I carried into her workshop. The folder was heavy not with paper but with meaning. When I arrived, she was leaning over the hood of a car, her hair falling in strands across her cheek, and Chewie sat cross-legged on the floor, trying to assemble a carburetor from memory. They both looked up as I entered, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't an intruder but someone expected. I placed the folder on the workbench, sliding it toward her. "This is not another offer," I said, my voice unsteady. "It's something I should have done years ago, something my father should have done decades ago." She wiped her hands, suspicion in her eyes, and opened the folder. Inside were the official papers, stamped and sealed. The establishment of a free mechanical school, fully funded, bearing the name John Edward Barnes Technical Institute. Her fingers hovered above the page as though she didn't dare touch it. "What is this?" "It's your father's legacy," I said quietly. "The one that was stolen from him. I can't erase the past, but I can make sure the future remembers him. A school where anyone with a passion for machines can learn, regardless of money or status. Built on his name, not mine." Her breath caught. For a moment, I saw the hard armor she always carried begin to crack. "You'd give away your resources for this?" I nodded. "For him. For you. For every voice silenced by people like my father. And because I don't want to live another day polishing lies." She closed the folder, pressing it to her chest, her eyes shimmering though she tried to steady them. "You don't understand what this means." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Then help me understand. Not as my employee, not as a charity case, as my equal, as my partner." The word hung in the air heavier than any proposal I had ever made. She looked at me for a long time, the grease on her face streaked where a tear slipped free despite her effort to stop it. At last she whispered, "If you mean this, then yes. Not for you. Not even for me. For him." Chewie leapt to his feet, grinning, sensing the gravity even if he couldn't fully grasp it. "Does that mean we're building something bigger now?" I laughed, though my throat was tight. "Yes, Chewie. Something bigger than all of us." That night, the three of us stood together over the engine we had revived from rust and ruin. I turned the key, and once again it roared to life, louder, stronger, as though it too understood what was beginning. The vibrations rattled the walls, but instead of sounding harsh, it felt like a hymn, raw, imperfect, alive. She stood beside me, her shoulder brushing mine, her eyes fixed on the machine but her hand finding mine. For years I had believed engines were just iron and numbers. Now, with her fingers tightening around mine, I knew the truth. Engines breathe. Engines remember. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, engines forgive. I looked at her, at Chewie, at the sign above the workshop freshly painted with her father's name, and I realized that I no longer carried the weight of an unwanted inheritance. I was building a new one, one that had a soul. And as the engine's rhythm filled the night, so did something else. Hope.